You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws crumbled, only one rule remains. Break it, and you're cast into digital oblivion. The rule? Subscribe and hit that like button. We hit 11,000 souls, but we're hungry for more. Next stop, 100,000 before 2027. We're also on Spotify now and devoid of fears if you want fewer ads or to listen with your phone off. So subscribe, like, and let's take over every platform out there. Now let's dive into today's story. Dr. Thea Corvus noticed the pattern at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night she'd remember for the rest of her life. Outside her office window at the Global Health Institute in Geneva, Lake Geneva reflected scattered city lights like dropped coins. She'd been cross-referencing historical population data with documented angelic apparitions for 6 hours, surviving on coffee that had gone cold 3 times. The correlation made her hands shake. Fatima, Portugal, 1917. 3 shepherd children, Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, reported seeing an angel in spring, followed by the Virgin Mary over 6 months. The final apparition in October drew 70,000 witnesses who reported seeing the sun dance in the sky. Photographs captured the crowd staring upward, umbrellas abandoned in the mud despite rain moments before. 6 months later, the Spanish flu swept through Europe like a scythe through wheat. 50 million dead worldwide. She pulled up the growth charts, overlaying mortality data with population projections. The pandemic had reset global population growth by exactly 40 years, bringing it back to levels last seen in the 1870s. But that could be coincidence. One data point proved nothing. She needed more. Zeitoun, Egypt, 1968 to 1971. A luminous figure appearing above St. Mary's Coptic Church, witnessed by 250,000 people over 3 years. Muslims, Coptic Christians, skeptics, journalists, government officials, all seeing the same phenomenon. President Gamal Abdel Nasser himself confirmed the sightings. Newspapers published photographs showing a glowing form on the church roof. The Vatican sent investigators who witnessed it firsthand and filed reports confirming something extraordinary was occurring. Thea's stomach knotted as she pulled up Egypt's demographic data for that period. The country's population had been exploding at an unsustainable rate, straining resources past breaking point after their devastating loss in the Six-Day War of 1967. Urban infrastructure was collapsing under the weight of rural migration to Cairo and Alexandria. Food shortages were becoming critical, but over the following decade, through a combination of economic collapse, emigration, and unexplained increases in mortality rates, population growth slowed to exactly sustainable levels for the region's agricultural output and water resources. Her cursor hovered over the next file. She already knew what she'd find, but she had to see it with her own eyes. Kibeho, Rwanda, November 28th, 1981. The Virgin Mary appeared to 16-year-old Alphonsine Mumareke at a Catholic boarding school in a small village in southwestern Rwanda. The girl was in the cafeteria helping with dishes when she heard a voice calling her name. She went into the hallway and saw a beautiful woman floating in a cloud of light, identifying herself as Nina Wajambo, Mother of the Word. Over the next 8 years, the apparitions continued, with 2 other girls, Natalie Mukamazimpaka and Marie-Claire Mukangango, also experiencing visions. The messages emphasized prayer, suffering, repentance, and the need for Rwanda to turn back from hatred. Then, on August 19th, 1982, all 3 girls experienced the same apocalyptic vision simultaneously in front of hundreds of witnesses. They described rivers of blood flowing through Rwanda, decapitated heads, bodies stacked like firewood, a nation drowning in ethnic hatred. They spoke of trees on fire, open chasms, and a monster stalking the land. The visions were so disturbing that the Catholic Church initially hesitated to approve them. 13 years later, on April 6, 1994, everything the girls had seen came true. In 100 days, 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were slaughtered with machetes, clubs, and rifles. The school where the apparitions had occurred became an abattoir, its classrooms running with blood. Marie-Claire Mukangango, one of the 3 primary visionaries, was murdered along with her husband in Kigali. Thousands more died at that exact site in 2 separate massacres, first in April 1994, when Hutu militias attacked, then in April 1995, when Rwandan Patriotic Army soldiers opened fire on a refugee camp of over 100,000 people. Thea leaned back in her chair, feeling cold despite the office heating. She pulled up chronicles from the 1340s, dusty medieval accounts she'd never paid close attention to before. Monks and scholars across Europe describing luminous figures and armies of angels appearing in the skies above the city of Kaffa on the Black Sea in 1346. The accounts were remarkably consistent. Lights moving in formation, beings that glowed like stars, voices speaking in unknown languages. Shortly after, Genoese merchants fled Kaffa by ship after the Mongol army besieging the city began catapulting plague-infected corpses over the walls. Those ships carried plague rats to Messina, Sicily, and from there the Black Death spread across Europe like spilled ink across parchment. 30 to 50 million, dead over 5 years. Europe's population cut in half from approximately 80 million to 40 million. Florence lost 2/3 of its population. Some villages were completely abandoned, left to be reclaimed by forest. It took nearly 200 years for population levels to recover. Thea built a regression analysis, feeding in every documented mass apparition she could find for the past 1,000 years. The Marian apparitions at Lourdes in 1858, followed by waves of cholera. The visions at La Salette in 1846, before the Irish potato famine and subsequent European food crises. She went back further. Visions reported before the plague of Justinian in 541 CE, which killed an estimated 25 million. Even earlier, to accounts from ancient Rome describing celestial beings appearing before major plagues. The computer processed the data for 3 minutes. When the results appeared, Thea had to read them twice to believe what she was seeing. The correlation coefficient was 0.97, a statistical relationship so strong it was almost impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Every major apparition aligned with subsequent mortality events that returned regional or global populations to sustainable levels relative to agricultural capacity, water resources, and available technology. The deaths weren't random natural disasters. They were corrections to a formula. Her phone rang, shattering the silence. The caller ID showed a Vatican exchange with a Rome area code. Thea stared at it for 3 rings, her heart pounding against her ribs, then answered. "Dr. Corvus." The voice was American, older, with the kind of Italian inflection that came from decades abroad. "My name is Father Damien Crow. I know what you just discovered. I'm in Geneva right now. I can be at your office in 20 minutes. Who gave you this number?" "I have access to Vatican intelligence archives. Files most people don't know exist. I've been tracking the same pattern you have for 15 years. He paused, and she heard traffic in the background. "In 15 minutes, you'll receive an email with a scan of a manuscript page written in medieval Latin in 1666. It describes an angelic visitation that predicted the Great Fire of London, not metaphorically, with specific dates and casualty projections. After you read it, you'll understand why I need to see you tonight." The line went dead before she could respond. Thea sat staring at her phone. then at her computer screen with its damning correlation coefficients. 14 minutes later, an email arrived from an encrypted server with a Venezuelan IP address. The attachment was a high-resolution scan of aged parchment, the Latin text still clearly visible despite centuries of degradation and water damage. She copied the text into a translation program and read it 3 times, each time hoping she'd misunderstood something critical. She hadn't. At 1:30 a.m, she buzzed Father Damien Crow into the building. He was tall and gaunt, early 60s, with iron-grey hair that needed cutting, and eyes that had spent too many years reading by candlelight in basement archives. He wore a simple black shirt with a clerical collar and moved with the quiet, reverent steps of someone who'd spent decades walking through cathedrals. The leather case he carried looked older than both of them combined, cracked and weathered, but meticulously cared for. I was defrocked 15 years ago for asking uncomfortable questions about discrepancies in angelic apparition records, he said without preamble, setting the case on her desk with care. Questions about why the Vatican kept certain accounts sealed and others widely publicized. Why some miracles were approved immediately while others were suppressed for centuries. But I kept my archive access through friends who believed I was doing God's work. He met her eyes. Now I'm not sure whose work I'm doing. Inside the case were photocopies of documents so old the original ink had faded to brown, along with photographs of illuminated manuscripts, papal bulls, and handwritten accounts from priests and bishops spanning 1,000 years. He pulled out a sheaf of papers with careful, almost loving movements. These are from 1563. They were supposed to have been destroyed during the Council of Trent, when the Church decided which texts were acceptable and which were dangerous. Someone hid them instead. He laid the papers out. They describe angelic visitations not as blessings, not as miracles or divine interventions for human benefit, but as census events. The medieval term used is Numeratio mortis, the counting of the dead. Thea picked up the top page. Even through the photocopy, she could see the careful medieval script with its elaborate capitals, the marginal notes in multiple hands spanning centuries, comments in Latin, Italian, and what looked like medieval French. What exactly do they say? That angels appear when human populations exceed, carrying capacity for their geographical region and available resources. They appear to assess, to count, to measure against some cosmic standard we don't understand. Then they determine the necessary reduction to bring things back into balance. He pulled out another document, this one with an elaborate illuminated border, showing angels holding what looked disturbingly like surveying instruments, measuring rods, plumb lines, and what might have been early forms of ledgers or accounting books. The documents describe it as agricultural management. Humanity as a crop that must be periodically thinned so the whole field doesn't die from overcrowding and resource depletion. He pulled out the document she'd seen in the email. This is from Cardinal Matteo Rossi, written in September 1666, 3 days before the Great Fire of London began. He was visiting London on Vatican business, staying in a private residence near the Thames. He describes an encounter with an entity that appeared in his bedchamber at midnight. Thea read the translated text slowly, absorbing every detail. The Cardinal described being awakened by brilliant white light pouring through his window, so bright it hurt his eyes even through closed lids. When he opened the shutters, an entity floated outside, suspended in mid-air above the Thames, human-shaped, but fundamentally wrong. Too tall, perhaps 9 feet. If standing, too symmetrical, as if designed by mathematics rather than evolution. Covered in eyes that watched without blinking, arrayed in concentric circles around what might have been its torso. The being spoke directly into his mind, not in words but in concepts that translated automatically into understanding. It told him that humanity was cultivated like wheat in a field. When the field grows too dense, individual plants compete for resources, sunlight, water, nutrients. They become stunted, diseased, susceptible to blight. The entire crop fails. Therefore, the field must be thinned, weak plants removed, density reduced. This ensures the remaining plants can thrive and produce a good harvest. The angels, it explained, were the reapers. They had been performing this function since humans first learned to farm and settle in cities, since population density first became possible, and with it the risk of collapse from overcrowding. The cardinal, according to his own meticulous account, asked the most important question: what happens when you decide we've grown too much to harvest? When the field itself is dying from too much wheat? When even thinning cannot save it? The angel's response was documented in the cardinal's careful script. Then we burn the field entire and plant anew. This has been done before. This is the 7th planting. The 6 civilizations before yours exceeded capacity beyond recovery and were ploughed under completely. You are being granted chances we did not give to those who came before. We have grown patient with your species, but patience has limits. 3 days later, on September 2nd, 1666, fire began in a bakery on Pudding Lane at 1 o'clock in the morning. It burned for 4 days and 3 nights, destroying 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, St. Paul's Cathedral, and most of the civic buildings. The official death toll was recorded as only 6 people. But modern historians believe the real number was in the thousands, particularly among the poor, whose deaths went unrecorded in any official capacity. More importantly, the fire completely reset London's population density and forced a total rebuilding with better sanitation, wider streets, stone construction instead of timber, and improved infrastructure that prevented the kind of catastrophic overcrowding that had made the city vulnerable to repeated plague outbreaks. Thea looked up at Damien, her mouth dry. You believe this is real, literally real. I didn't want to. I spent 10 years trying to disprove it, trying to find alternative explanations, trying to convince myself these were just disturbed medieval minds trying to make sense of natural disasters. He sat down heavily. The evidence won anyway. The pattern is too consistent, too precise across too many centuries and continents. These aren't coincidences or confirmation bias. Something has been managing human population for millennia. He pulled out a manila folder containing modern printouts, satellite imagery with timestamp headers, thermal maps, spectral analyses, and now someone else has noticed the pattern. Someone with access to classified orbital surveillance systems. The images showed thermal patterns in the upper atmosphere, geometric arrangements of light and heat that shouldn't exist naturally. The timestamps ranged from 2004 to the present day, with notations in what looked like military classification codes. Where did you get these? From Owen Kellen, former National Reconnaissance Office satellite imaging analyst. He worked on classified reconnaissance programs for 12 years before he noticed something in the data that terrified him enough to defect. He's in Iceland now, living under political asylum. He's the one who contacted me 6 months ago, who connected your epidemiological research to his orbital observations, to my historical documents. Damien closed the folder. We need to meet with him, tonight if possible. Thea stood and walked to her window, looking out over the dark expanse of Lake Geneva. Everything in her scientific training screamed that this was impossible, absurd, the kind of conspiracy theory that got researchers laughed out of their fields and blacklisted from legitimate journals. But the data didn't lie. Statistical correlations of 0.97 didn't happen by accident. The pattern was too strong, too consistent across centuries and continents, and completely different cultures. If this is real, she said quietly, watching her reflection in the dark glass, if angelic apparitions, really are assessment events that precede calculated population reductions, then we need to ask the obvious question, when is the next one? Damien was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with dread. I think it's already beginning. The patterns Owen's been tracking, they're forming now. Right now. We have very little time. They flew to Reykjavik the next morning on the first available flight. Owen Kellen lived in a converted warehouse near the harbour, tucked between fish processing plants and shipping container storage yards. The kind of anonymous industrial space that wouldn't attract attention from curious neighbours or surveillance teams. Inside, it was packed with monitors, satellite receivers, custom-built computers, and enough data storage to run a small research university. He was younger than Thea expected, barely 40, with the nervous energy and dark circled eyes of someone who'd spent too long looking at classified things that kept him awake at night. "You're late," he said when they arrived, not looking away from his screens. The patterns intensified overnight. Significantly. "Look at this." He pulled up current satellite imagery, showing the upper atmosphere above 12 major cities. Mumbai, India, Lagos, Nigeria, Sao Paulo, Brazil, Jakarta, Indonesia, Cairo, Egypt, Mexico City, Mexico, Karachi, Pakistan, Manila, Philippines, Shanghai, China, Delhi, India, Tokyo, Japan, Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo. In each location, geometric patterns of light formed precise grids in the thermosphere, like someone had overlaid surveying maps onto the sky itself at 40,000 feet. "These appeared 8 hours ago," Owen said, fingers flying across his keyboard, pulling up enhanced images with false colour thermal mapping. "They're identical in structure to patterns I've documented before major disasters, but far more complex, more organised, more extensive. I've been tracking unusual atmospheric phenomena since I left the NRO 2 years ago, building a comprehensive database of these events. Want to know what I found?" He didn't wait for an answer, pulling up a detailed timeline on his main monitor. Indian Ocean tsunami, December 26th, 2004. These exact geometric patterns appeared in the upper atmosphere 72 hours before the earthquake and wave. Final death toll 227,898 people across 14 countries. That's not a round number. That's not an estimate. That's a specific, precise calculation. I cross-referenced it with regional population models and ecological carrying capacity assessments for the affected areas. The tsunami killed exactly, and I mean exactly, the number of people needed to bring Southeast Asian coastal populations back to 1994, sustainable levels based on available fresh water, agricultural output, and fishing stocks. Thea felt her stomach tighten. "Show me more." Hurricane Katrina, August 2005. These patterns appeared in the atmosphere 1 week before the storm formed in the Atlantic. Death toll, 1,833 people. Again, a specific number. Not rounded, not estimated. Brought New Orleans' population back to early 1990s levels, which was the last time the city's aging levee system and water management infrastructure could actually handle its population size and geographic footprint. He pulled up more data, image after image of geometric light patterns preceding disasters. Haiti earthquake, January 12, 2010. Patterns appeared 48 hours before the quake. Death toll, approximately 316,000 people. Reduced Port-au-Prince to sustainable population density for the first time in 30 years, given available water, sanitation, and food distribution systems. Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, Japan, March 11th, 2011. Patterns appeared 1 full week before the event. Death toll, 15,899 people. Brought coastal population density in the affected regions back to 1985 levels, when infrastructure could still handle the load. Damien leaned forward, studying the patterns with the intensity of someone trying to read ancient scripture. These are the same organizational structures from the medieval manuscripts. Different medium, same symbolic language, assessment grids. Owen nodded grimly. I also recovered something else from declassified archives that nobody paid attention to at the time. Zeitoun, Egypt, 1968 to 1971. The apparitions that hundreds of thousands of people witnessed on the ground over 3 years. From orbit, they looked like this. He pulled up grainy satellite imagery from the late 1960s, primitive by modern standards, but still clear enough to show geometric light patterns hovering over Cairo, arranged in precise grids that slowly scan the city, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, over the course of 3 years. The patterns were identical to the ones in his modern imagery, just captured with older technology. They were assessing population density, Thea said quietly, the implications settling over her like a heavy blanket. Counting, measuring, planning. And now they're back, Owen said, pulling up the current imagery again. The patterns forming right now are more extensive than anything in my entire database. 12 major cities simultaneously, all of them in the developing world where population has exploded in recent decades. If this follows the same progression as previous events, assessment period followed by calculated mortality event, we're looking at something unprecedented, a global population reduction event, and based on the complexity and extent of these patterns, the scope is going to be massive. Thea sat down heavily in one of Owen's desk chairs. I need to build a predictive model. If there's really a consistent pattern here, if population reduction events are calculated to return regions to sustainable carrying capacity, then I can project what they're planning. I can estimate the scope and timeline. I have the computing power, Owen said, gesturing at his server racks humming in the corner. And I have 70 years of compiled demographic and ecological data from every legitimate and illegitimate source I could access. Government databases, academic institutions, corporate environmental assessments, leaked internal reports. Tell me what variables you need. They worked for 18 hours straight, pausing only for coffee and bathroom breaks. Thea built a sophisticated multivariable model incorporating historical population growth curves, current resource consumption rates across different regions, climate collapse indicators, freshwater depletion rates, topsoil erosion measurements, ocean acidification levels, deforestation data, and carrying capacity estimates for different geographical regions based on available technology and infrastructure. She inputted the current global population, 8.1 billion people. The model ran for 40 minutes, processing thousands of variables and centuries of data, building probability matrices and outcome scenarios. When it finished, Thea stared at the results in complete silence for almost a full minute. "What is it?" Damien asked, moving closer to read the screen. The model projects a major population reduction event beginning in 19 days. Simultaneous occurrences across every continent, focused on the 12 cities showing the atmospheric patterns. Projected death toll. Her voice caught. 2.4 billion people. Owen went pale, his hands frozen over his keyboard. That's not possible. Nothing in recorded history has killed that many people, not even close. The Black Death was 50 million over 5 years. Spanish flu was 50 million in 18 months. This is saying 2.4 billion in a matter of days or weeks. The Black Death killed half of Europe with medieval technology. Rats and fleas, Thea said quietly. The Spanish flu killed 50 million with an airborne virus in a world that still relied on ships and trains for long-distance travel. If these entities have the capability to trigger targeted mortality events, to select specific populations based on criteria we don't understand, using methods beyond our comprehension. Her voice trailed off. "What's the logic?" Damien asked, leaning over her shoulder to study the data. "Why 2.4 billion specifically? There has to be a reason for that precise number." Thea pulled up another set of graphs overlaying historical population data with ecological sustainability metrics. It would return global population to approximately 5.7 billion people. That was the global population in 1975. According to every major ecological model I can find, and I've checked multiple sources, 1975 was the last year when human consumption was theoretically sustainable on a global scale, the last year when we weren't yet in ecological overshoot. She highlighted specific data points. In 1975, humanity wasn't yet exceeding the planet's renewable capacity for fresh water, topsoil regeneration, wild fish stocks, atmospheric carbon absorption, or biodiversity maintenance. We were at the edge, but not over it yet. We crossed into ecological overshoot, drawing down resources faster than they can regenerate, sometime in the mid to late 1970s. We've been living on borrowed time ever since, essentially mining the planet's natural capital instead of living on the renewable interest. She looked at them both, the implications stark and terrible. The model suggests they're planning to reset us, return humanity to the last sustainable baseline population, and give us another chance to get it right, another chance to live within our means. At the cost of 2.4 billion lives, Owen said quietly, his voice hollow. Before any of them could respond, Owen's monitors suddenly flashed with incoming data alerts, new satellite imagery, automatically flagged by his tracking software as matching the target parameters. The patterns over the 12 cities had intensified dramatically in just the last hour, the grids tightening, geometry becoming more complex and three-dimensional. And there was something else, something new. "Those are heat signatures," Owen said, zooming in on Mumbai with hands that trembled slightly. "Massive thermal anomalies at approximately 40,000 feet altitude. Nothing natural should be generating that kind of heat signature at that altitude. These readings are off the scale." Similar signatures were appearing over the other 11 cities: Lagos, Sao Paulo, Jakarta, Cairo, Mexico City, Karachi, Manila, Shanghai, Delhi, Tokyo, Kinshasa. Identical thermal patterns, identical altitudes appearing simultaneously. "They're arriving," Damien whispered, making the sign of the cross without seeming to realize he was doing it. "The assessment phase is transitioning. The entities themselves are manifesting." Thea checked her model's timeline projection, a cold knot forming in her stomach. The projection said 19 days until the event begins. If the entities are already manifesting in measurable ways, if we're seeing actual thermal signatures and intensified patterns, we might have significantly less time than that. "Time for what?" Owen asked, turning to face them both. "What can we possibly do? How do you stop or even slow down forces that have been doing this for thousands of years? How do you fight entities that can kill with precision across continents?" It was a good question, and none of them had an answer. What do you do when cosmic forces beyond human comprehension decide your species needs culling? How do you fight beings that operate on timescales of centuries and view human civilization as something to be managed, like a garden? Damien pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. "There's someone else we need to talk to before we make any decisions. Someone who survived a direct encounter with one of these entities. A close encounter, face to face. She might be able to tell us what we're really facing, what to expect when they fully manifest." "Who?" Thea asked. "A nun, Sister Beatrice Holt. She was working at a refugee camp in South Sudan 6 years ago when one of these entities appeared to her directly. She's the only person I've found who had a sustained close-range encounter and survived with her memory intact. Most people who get that close either die or lose their minds. She's in a psychiatric facility in Vermont now, but she's lucid. Traumatized but lucid. She might have information we need." They flew to the United States the next day. a tense 11-hour flight during which Thea continually checked her laptop for updates from Owen, who'd remained in Reykjavik to monitor the developing situation. The thermal signatures were strengthening. The geometric patterns were becoming visible on regular weather satellites now, not just classified military systems. Sister Beatrice Holt lived in a private psychiatric care facility in rural Vermont, a converted Victorian mansion surrounded by maple trees and rolling hills. She was 47 years old according to her file, with prematurely grey hair pulled back in a simple bun, and the kind of profound stillness that came from experiencing something that fundamentally changed your understanding of reality. The staff said she rarely spoke, spent most of her days in her room, drawing the same images over and over, and refused to discuss what had happened to her in South Sudan. Her medical records indicated severe PTSD, persistent nightmares, and what the psychiatrists labelled as religious delusions, though they admitted her descriptions remained remarkably consistent over 6 years. When Thea and Damien arrived, they found her in the garden, sitting on a stone bench with a large sketch pad balanced on her lap. She looked up as they approached along the gravel path, and Thea saw immediate recognition flash in her eyes, not of them as individuals, but of what they represented. People who knew. People who believed. "You've seen the patterns?" Sister Beatrice said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Damien answered gently, sitting on the bench beside her. "We need to know what happened to you. We need to understand what we're facing." Sister Beatrice studied them both for a long moment with eyes that had seen too much, then nodded slowly and stood. "Come inside. I'll show you." Her room in the facility was modest. A single bed, a desk, a chair, a small bathroom. But the walls were covered in drawings. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, taped up in overlapping layers like scales on a fish. All depicting the same thing. Concentric rings covered in symbols, arranged in precise geometric patterns that hurt to look at for too long. "May 14th, 2020, she began, sitting on her bed, while Thea and Damien remained standing. "My 41st birthday. I was working at a refugee camp in South Sudan, about 40 miles from Juba. The camp housed about 120,000 people, mostly displaced by the ongoing civil conflict. Conditions were terrible, overcrowded, inadequate sanitation, food shortages, disease outbreaks every few weeks." She pulled out a specific drawing from a folder on her desk, more detailed than the others, with annotations in small, precise handwriting. "The sky opened at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a clear day. No clouds, no warning. Everyone in the camp saw the light, this brilliant white gold radiance that seemed to pour down from a rip in the sky itself. But I was the only one who saw it directly, who looked straight at it without turning away. The others looked, and then couldn't look anymore. They turned their faces, covered their eyes, but I couldn't, I was frozen." "What did you see?" Thea asked softly. Sister Beatrice pulled out her most detailed drawing, holding it with hands that trembled slightly. It was approximately 15 feet tall, though it's hard to judge scale when something is floating 20 feet off the ground. Not humanoid. Not exactly. But the shape suggested a human form the way a crude sketch suggests a face. It was composed of concentric rings that rotated independently of each other, like nested gyroscopes, but far more complex. The rings were covered in eyes, thousands of them, different sizes, different colours, all watching simultaneously. They didn't blink, they didn't move, they just watched everything all at once. She traced the drawing with one finger, and there were symbols covering every surface between the eyes. Not writing exactly, but something like it. They shifted and changed as I watched, recalculating, updating. I understood later they were keeping count, tallying, measuring. "What did it do?" Thea asked, crouching down to examine the drawing more closely. "It asked me questions. Not out loud, I never heard a voice with my ears. The words came from inside my head in a language I've never heard before or since, but I understood it perfectly. Every word was immediately comprehensible. Sister Beatrice's hands tightened on the sketch pad. It asked my age, my exact age in years, months and days, my health status. It wanted to know about chronic conditions, genetic markers, previous illnesses. It asked how many pregnancies I'd had, whether I planned to have children, whether I was capable of bearing children, my occupation, my education level, my skills. It was cataloguing me. Then what happened? Damien asked. Then it said one word, just one. Non-essential. Sister Beatrice's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and I understood what it meant in that moment. I wasn't worth preserving. Based on whatever criteria it was using, my age, my lack of children, my role, I wasn't valuable enough to keep. I was marked for removal, though not immediate removal. I was in some kind of secondary category. But you survived, Owen pointed out. Within 8 days, 83,000 people in that camp and the surrounding region died from a hemorrhagic fever that no one could identify. It appeared suddenly, killed rapidly, and then vanished completely. Sister Beatrice stood and walked to her window, looking out at the peaceful Vermont landscape. Medical teams from WHO came, Doctors Without Borders, CDC sent specialists. Nobody could isolate the pathogen, couldn't determine the transmission vector, couldn't identify the disease mechanism. People just started bleeding from their eyes, nose, mouth, and then died within hours, some within minutes. She turned back to face them, but not everyone died. That's the important part. The survivors had a pattern. All children under 12 years old survived. All adults between the ages of 18 and 45 who were in good health survived. Anyone with serious chronic illness died. Anyone over 60 died. Anyone with significant disabilities died. The old, the sick, the weak, all dead within a week. A precise culling based on utility and reproductive viability. And you survived because, Thea prompted, because even though I was classified as non-essential, I apparently wasn't selected for immediate removal. I was 41, healthy, educated, with useful skills. Not optimal for reproduction, but not completely outside the window. So I lived, but I was marked, changed. I can still feel it watching me sometimes, even now, 6 years later, evaluating whether my status has changed, whether I've moved from one category to another. She handed Owen her most detailed drawing. These symbols, they're not decorative or mystical. They're functional, administrative. I've spent 6 years trying to understand them, seeing them every night in my dreams. They're counting markers, tally systems, population accounting. Each cluster represents population units, resource allocations, acceptable loss margins, sustainability thresholds. It's all mathematics, cold calculation. Owen studied the drawing intently, then pulled out his phone and compared it to the satellite imagery of the atmospheric patterns. His face went even paler. They're identical, the same organizational structure, the same symbolic language, the same geometric relationships. Whatever you saw 6 years ago at ground level, we're seeing now from orbit on a massive scale. Because they're doing the same thing now that they did then, Sister Beatrice said, meeting his eyes. They're counting, measuring, running their assessment, determining who's essential and who isn't, who contributes to sustainability and who threatens it. And when they finish their counting, she didn't need to complete the sentence. "Can I show you something?" Thea asked, pulling out a laptop. She opened her model and showed Sister Beatrice the projections, the timeline, the estimated scope. Sister Beatrice looked at the data for a long time, her expression unreadable. "Your original projection said 19 days. That was 3 days ago. We have 16 days left, maybe less. If the manifestation is accelerating, You don't seem surprised by the numbers, Owen observed. I've been feeling it building for the past 2 weeks. The same presence I felt 6 years ago in South Sudan. It's watching again, closer now, more focused. The attention is intensifying. She looked at each of them in turn. You came here hoping I could tell you how to stop this. I can't. I don't think anyone can. But I can tell you what's going to happen when the counting is finished and the culling begins. She pulled out another series of drawings, these showing multiple entities hovering over a sprawling cityscape. They won't come alone. What visited me in Sudan was a scout, an assessment unit doing local population evaluation. When the actual global event begins, they'll arrive in force. Multiple entities, one over every major population centre, and they won't be subtle or invisible like they sometimes are. Everyone will see them. Every person on Earth will know they're there. And then? Damien asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Then people start dying. Not violently, not with fire and destruction. They'll just stop. Hearts will cease beating, brains will go dark, bodies will drop where they stand. And it won't be random or chaotic. It'll be systematic, organised, precise to the individual level. They'll take exactly who they need to take to hit their target numbers based on their assessment criteria: age, health, reproductive capacity, skills, utility to the surviving population structure, all calculated in advance. Thea felt cold despite the warm afternoon sun streaming through the window. How do you know all this? Did the entity tell you? Yes, before it left it showed me. Not as a warning to prevent what's coming, as a promise of what will happen. It showed me the next assessment event, the global one. Showed me what happens when an entire species exceeds acceptable carrying capacity across the whole planet rather than just one region. Sister Beatrice's voice dropped to barely a whisper. It showed me the counting of the dead on a scale I couldn't comprehend. Billions marked, billions measured, billions found unnecessary. Over the next 11 days, the team worked frantically to gather more evidence, to build a compelling case, to find some way to warn people or prevent what was coming. They contacted government officials who dismissed them as cranks. They tried to reach major media outlets who laughed them out of newsrooms. They attempted to publish their findings in scientific journals who rejected the papers without review, as obviously fraudulent. The data was dismissed as correlation hunting, cherry-picking coincidences to support a predetermined conclusion. The historical documents were written off as medieval superstition, metaphorical accounts misinterpreted literally. The satellite imagery was explained away as misidentified atmospheric phenomena, temperature inversions, aurora effects, or instrument malfunctions. Nobody wanted to believe that angelic beings were real and had been systematically managing human population for millennia. The implications were too disturbing, too incompatible with modern worldviews. On the 12th day, Tobias Kane found them. He walked into Owen's warehouse in Reykjavik without knocking, carrying a battered backpack and wearing clothes that suggested he'd been travelling for days without stopping. He was 40 years old, lean and weather-beaten from decades spent in disaster zones, with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much suffering and couldn't look away. "You're the ones tracking the pattern," he said without preamble. "The angelic apparitions and mortality events. I've been looking for you for 6 months." "Who are you?" Owen demanded, hand moving toward the phone. "Tobias Kane, freelance journalist specializing in disaster coverage and post-crisis analysis. I've been investigating angel sightings for 20 years, ever since I survived the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. He dropped his backpack and pulled out a worn leather notebook stuffed with clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes. "I know what you've discovered. I've been documenting the same thing from a different angle. We need to work together." He sat down without being invited and opened his notebook. "I was in Khao Lak, Thailand, photographing the aftermath. 2 days after the wave hit. The devastation was incomprehensible. Entire hotels torn apart, cars wrapped around palm trees, bodies everywhere. But I'm a data person, always have been. I started looking at the casualty statistics as they came in. The final death toll for the entire event across all affected countries was 227,898 people, not approximately 230,000, not rounded to 225,000, exactly 227,898. He pulled out a graph. That number bothered me. It was too precise. So I started digging into population models and ecological carrying capacity assessments for the affected regions, and I found that 227,898 was the exact number, down to individual people, needed to bring Southeast Asian coastal populations back to 1994 sustainable levels based on available fresh water, fish stocks, agricultural output, and infrastructure capacity. "You think the tsunami was deliberately calibrated?" Thea said. "I think something triggered the tsunami with a specific target in mind. After I realized that, I started looking at other disasters through the same lens." His research was extensive and disturbing, filling multiple notebooks, spanning 2 decades. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Residents and survivors reported seeing beings of light 3 months before the attacks in both cities. The combined death toll of both atomic bombings matched urban population excess projections made by Japanese agricultural ministries in 1941 before the war expanded. The Spanish flu pandemic, mass sightings of luminous entities reported across 17 countries in spring 1918, months before the pandemic really exploded globally. Newspapers from the time documented the sightings but attributed them to war hysteria or mass delusion. Final death toll, 50 million people. Global population growth reset by exactly 40 years, bringing it back to levels last seen in the 1870s. Every major disaster for the past century showed the same disturbing pattern. Angelic or luminous entity sightings beforehand, often months in advance. Precise death tolls afterwards that exactly matched population reduction targets. Regional populations returned to sustainable carrying capacity levels. "The question isn't whether this is real," Tobias said, looking at each of them in turn. "I gave up questioning that years ago, when the evidence became overwhelming. The question is what we do about it. How do we respond when we know what's coming?" "There's nothing we can do," Owen said bitterly, gesturing at his monitors, showing the intensifying atmospheric patterns. "We can't fight them. We can't even warn people effectively because nobody believes us. Who's going to take seriously the claim that angels are coming to kill 2.4 billion people because we're exceeding Earth's carrying capacity? We sound insane." Damien had been quiet throughout Tobias's presentation, absorbing the information. Now he spoke up. "In the medieval documents, there's a theological concept that keeps appearing in different forms. Numeratio mortis, the counting of the dead. But the interesting part isn't the counting itself, it's the theological framework the medieval scholars built around it. They struggled with the same existential questions we're struggling with now. How could divine or angelic entities do something so terrible? How could beings associated with God and goodness deliberately kill millions of people?" "What conclusion did they reach?" Thea asked. "That these entities aren't operating on human morality or human values. They're not good or evil. In any sense we understand those concepts. They're administrative, functional, regulatory. They manage human population the same way farmers manage livestock or foresters manage timber. When the herd gets too large for the available grazing land, you cull it back to sustainable numbers. When the forest gets too dense and fire risk becomes unacceptable, you thin it out, not out of cruelty or malice, out of necessity for the long-term health of the whole system." "That's supposed to make us feel better?" Owen asked bitterly. that we're just cattle being managed by cosmic ranchers. No, it's not supposed to make anyone feel better, but it might help us understand what we're dealing with. These entities don't hate humanity. They're not punishing us for sins or moral failures. In their perspective, killing 2.4 billion people isn't murder or genocide. It's conservation. It's sustainable population management. It's preventing total collapse that would kill everyone. Thea pulled up her model again, staring at the countdown timer in the corner of her screen. 73 hours until the projected event window opened. Sister Beatrice said they'll be visible to everyone when they fully manifest. That means we'll have some warning period, maybe hours, maybe minutes, between when they appear and when the dying starts. If we can document everything that happens, record it all and broadcast it globally, then at least people will know the truth. At least the deaths will be witnessed and understood, rather than dying in confusion and terror. "You want to live stream the apocalypse?" Tobias said. It wasn't a question. "I want to make sure that if 2.4 billion people die, their deaths aren't in vain. That the survivors understand exactly what happened and why. That maybe, possibly, humanity can learn from this and avoid triggering the next culling. We'll have 73 years according to the patterns. 73 years to prove we can manage our own population, live within our means, stop destroying the ecological systems that sustain us. I want to give humanity that chance by making sure the truth is undeniable." Owen was already pulling out broadcasting equipment from storage. "I have satellite uplinks, encrypted streaming systems, redundant servers, distributed across multiple countries with different legal jurisdictions. If we're going to do this, we do it properly. Multiple camera angles, real-time data overlays, everything documented from multiple independent sources. Make it impossible to dismiss or cover up." They spent the next 2.5 days in frantic preparation. Owen set up cameras and monitoring equipment at strategic locations across Reykjavik. Thea refined her model continuously, running constant updates as new data came in from Owen's satellite feeds. The atmospheric patterns were intensifying exponentially now, visible even on commercial weather satellites. Damien compiled historical accounts and theological context into a comprehensive document that could provide framework for understanding what was happening. Tobias prepared his broadcast narrative, the story he would tell as events unfolded in real time. Sister Beatrice joined them on the final day, checking herself out of the Vermont facility against medical advice and flying to Iceland. "I need to be there," she said simply when they questioned her decision. "I was marked 6 years ago. Whatever happens, I need to witness it. I need to see this through to whatever end comes." The countdown reached 0 at 9:17 a.m. local time on a Wednesday morning. The sky opened. People would later struggle to describe it adequately, reaching for metaphors that fell short. The most common description was that reality itself tore, as if someone had taken a massive blade to the fabric of the atmosphere and cut through it. The rips appeared simultaneously above the 12 cities identified in Owen's satellite imagery, and through each rip, something descended. They were enormous beyond human scale. Each entity dwarfed the tallest skyscrapers, hovering at approximately 30,000 feet altitude. Their bodies, if they could be called bodies in any conventional sense, were composed of concentric rings that rotated independently of each other like some impossible cosmic mechanism. The rings were covered in symbols that shifted and recalculated in real time, updating faster than human eyes could track, and covering every available surface between the symbols were eyes. Thousands upon thousands of eyes. Different sizes, different colours, all unblinking, all watching everything simultaneously. The entity that appeared above New York City was designated Unit 7 by CNN anchors who were struggling desperately to make sense of what they were seeing on live television. Similar entities appeared over Mumbai, Lagos, Sao Paulo, Jakarta, Cairo, Mexico City, Karachi, Manila, Shanghai, Delhi, Tokyo, and Kinshasa. 12 entities, 12 cities, all appearing at precisely the same moment across different time zones. They didn't move after their initial descent. They didn't speak or broadcast messages. They simply hovered in perfect stillness at their designated altitudes, visible to billions of people simultaneously, impossible to deny or rationalize away as mass hallucination or hoax. And then, 93 minutes after their appearance, people started dying. In New York, a 58-year-old businessman collapsed on the subway platform at Grand Central Station. His heart simply stopped, mid-beat. No pain, no chest clutching, no dramatic death scene. He was walking, and then he wasn't. His body dropped like someone had cut his strings. Within 3 minutes, similar reports began flooding in from across the 5 boroughs. Elderly people in nursing homes suddenly dying in their beds. Hospital patients with chronic conditions coding simultaneously. Long-term prisoners in Rikers Island dropping dead in their cells. Homeless individuals dying on sidewalks, all dying in the same way. Hearts stopping, brains ceasing all electrical activity, bodies dropping where they stood. The pattern repeated in every city beneath the entities. Paramedics in emergency rooms were overwhelmed within the first hour as the death toll climbed exponentially. But medical examiners who managed to perform rapid assessments found something disturbing. The deaths weren't random. There was a precise selection criteria being applied. Anyone over 75 years old, dying. Anyone with chronic illness requiring ongoing medical intervention, dying. Anyone with severe physical or cognitive disability, dying. Anyone incarcerated for more than 10 years, dying. Anyone homeless without family or community support structures, dying. Anyone society had categorized, explicitly or implicitly, as non-productive or resource-intensive, dying. In the first hour, 17 million people died worldwide. The number climbed steadily, mathematically, towards some predetermined target. Thea watched data stream in from multiple sources: government health agencies, hospital networks, emergency services, social media reports, all feeding into her model in real time. The deaths were following her projections with terrifying precision. The entities were executing a calculated population reduction with surgical accuracy across 12 cities simultaneously. "They're not killing indiscriminately," she said, her voice hollow as she watched the numbers climb. "They're selecting, choosing who lives and dies based on utility, productivity, future contribution to population sustainability." It's exactly what Sister Beatrice described: individual-level assessment and targeted removal. Tobias was broadcasting live from a rooftop in Reykjavik. His camera, capturing both the entity hovering over the city, smaller than the ones over major population centres but present nonetheless, and the data streaming across Owen's monitors. His voice was steady despite the magnitude of what he was documenting. This is what we're witnessing across the globe right now. Simultaneous mortality events in 12 major population centres, plus dozens of smaller cities. The deaths appear targeted, systematic, following specific selection criteria we're still trying to fully understand. Entities that witnesses are calling angels are hovering over each affected city, visible to millions of people, and beneath them people are dying by the thousands every minute. He turned to face the camera directly, speaking with the authority of someone who'd spent 20 years preparing for this moment. "I know how this sounds to anyone watching. I know what you're thinking. This must be fake. This must be some elaborate hoax or mass hysteria. But this is happening, right now, across the entire planet, and based on historical patterns that we've been documenting for years. This is not the first time. These entities have appeared throughout history, always before major mortality events. Fatima, Portugal in 1917, before the Spanish flu pandemic. Zeitoun, Egypt in 1968, during regional population crises. Kibeho, Rwanda, in 1981, 13 years before the genocide. They appear to measure, to count, to assess, and then populations are reduced to sustainable levels. In Vermont, Sister Beatrice felt the presence intensify with crushing weight. She walked outside the facility where she'd been staying, past staff members who were frozen in front of television screens showing the global crisis unfolding, and looked up at the sky above the peaceful Vermont countryside. The entity that had assessed her 6 years ago in South Sudan had returned. She recognized it immediately. The same configuration of rings, the same arrangement of eyes, the same symbolic language covering its surface. It descended slowly, deliberately, its lowest ring stopping at approximately 1,000 feet above the facility. She felt the attention focus on her specifically, could feel herself being evaluated again with that same alien consciousness that had marked her as non-essential 6 years ago. The assessment ran through her mind like incomprehensible code that somehow translated into understanding. Subject: Beatrice Holt. Age 47 years 6 months, 3 days. Health status: excellent. No chronic conditions. No genetic disorders of concern. Fertility: viable for approximately 2.8 more years. Skills: medical training, multilingual capability, psychological resilience, confirmed through previous assessment and subsequent observation. Previous designation: non-essential secondary category. Current status: re-evaluation in progress. The presence intensified, becoming almost unbearable, like being examined by a microscope that could see not just your body, but your entire existence, your potential utility to the species' survival. Then, new designation: reserve reproductive stock, priority preservation category, utility assessment, medium-term population, recovery support, medical infrastructure maintenance, psychological trauma management for surviving populations. Retention confirmed. Sister Beatrice felt something like relief and horror mixed together in a way that made her stomach turn. She'd been reclassified. 6 years ago, she wasn't worth saving. Now suddenly she was useful. Now she would survive because her skills and remain in reproductive capacity had value to whatever came after. Around her, 13 staff members collapsed simultaneously and died within 30 seconds. Their bodies simply stopped functioning mid-movement, dropping to the ground like puppets with cut strings. Only certain staff remained standing. 4 nurses, 2 doctors, 3 maintenance workers, all between 25 and 40 years old. All in excellent health, all fertile, capable of contributing to population recovery. The entity wasn't protecting them. It was preserving them, selecting them as foundation breeding stock and skilled labor for whatever civilization emerged from the culling. Across the world, the death toll continued to climb with mathematical precision. 20 million dead, 50 million, 100 million. The entities remained perfectly still, except for their constantly rotating rings, their endless eyes watching, their symbols recalculating based on real-time data about who had been removed and who remained. In Times Square, Tobias Kane broadcast from the street as bodies accumulated around him in growing piles that overwhelmed emergency services' ability to collect them. He was 39 years old, in good health, no chronic conditions, no history of serious illness. The selection criteria didn't include him. He would survive to witness and document. "This isn't random," he said, voice cracking with emotion, as he gestured at the bodies surrounding him. "This isn't a plague, or natural disaster, or any kind of accident. This is deliberate, calculated, precise. These entities are reducing human population with surgical accuracy, based on selection criteria we can only partially understand. Age, health status, productivity, reproductive capacity, utility to surviving population structures. They're choosing who lives and who dies based on some cosmic calculus of sustainability. He gestured up at the entity hovering above Manhattan, its massive form blocking out a significant portion of the sky. They're not demons. They're not evil in any way we understand evil. They're gardeners. We're the crop. And the field has grown too dense. The plants are competing for resources. The whole system is at risk of collapse. So they're thinning us, removing the excess, reducing us back to sustainable levels. That's all this is. That's all it's ever been. We are being harvested. The deaths continued for 42 hours straight. Hospitals were first overwhelmed by the flood of casualties, then gradually emptied as the deaths became so numerous and so clearly untreatable that people stopped bringing bodies in. Morgues filled beyond any possible capacity within the first 12 hours. City services collapsed under the sheer weight of billions of bodies that needed to be processed, identified, buried, or cremated. Governments issued emergency declarations, imposed martial law, mobilized military forces to try maintaining order as society fractured under the strain. But the dying was precise, never excessive, never wasteful. The entities took exactly who they needed, and no more. When a particular city or region reached its calculated target reduction, the deaths in that specific area simply stopped while continuing elsewhere. At hour 42, the global death toll reached 2,387,612,000. 2,387,612,000 human beings dead. The dying stopped. Complete cessation, instant and simultaneous, across the entire planet. No more bodies dropping. No more hearts stopping. The culling had reached its target with precision that would have been impossible for any human organization to achieve. The entities remained for another 6 hours, continuing to hover above their designated cities, their rings still rotating steadily, their symbols still recalculating and updating based on the new population reality. Then, simultaneously across all 12 primary locations and dozens of smaller manifestation sites, a transmission was detected on every frequency, simultaneously. Radio, television, cellular networks, satellite communications, even emergency services bands. Every communication system humanity had built suddenly carried the same signal. It wasn't words in any human language. It wasn't even sound in a conventional sense. But every human who heard or felt the transmission understood its meaning perfectly, the message translating directly into consciousness in whatever language they thought in. Population reduced to sustainable levels. Current global population, 5,712,388,000. Acceptable range, 5.5 billion to 6.0 billion. Continued monitoring. Active. Next, comprehensive assessment, 73 years. Compliance with carrying capacity, mandatory. Resource consumption must remain within regenerative limits. Deviation from sustainability parameters will result in corrective intervention. Failure to maintain compliance will result in complete population reset and civilization restart. The entities began to rise, ascending back through the rips in the atmosphere from which they'd emerged 42 hours earlier, but they didn't disappear completely. They faded, becoming less visible to human eyes but remaining detectable on satellite imagery. Their presence, still measurable, in the upper atmosphere as geometric light patterns and thermal signatures. Still watching, still counting, always counting, waiting to see if humanity had learned its lesson, or if the seventh planting would need to be ploughed under, like the 6 civilizations before it. The immediate aftermath was chaos on a scale that defied comprehension. 5.7 billion survivors, trying to process the traumatic death of 2.4 billion people within 42 hours. Every family on Earth had lost someone. Every community had bodies to bury. Infrastructure collapsed as power plants, water systems, and supply chains lost critical personnel. Governments dissolved or fell into internal conflict as political structures fractured. Cities burned as desperate survivors fought over suddenly scarce resources, even though resources weren't actually scarce, just distribution systems had broken down. But within the chaos and grief, certain patterns began to emerge that suggested the culling had been calculated not just for immediate population reduction, but for optimized recovery. The survivors were, by clear design, predominantly young, healthy, and fertile. The entities had selected for maximum recovery potential, maximum adaptability, maximum productive capacity. The age distribution of survivors showed a clear spike in the 25 to 45 age range. The health status of survivors showed almost no chronic illness, no major genetic disorders, minimal need for ongoing medical intervention. Within 3 weeks of the event, survivor communities began forming organically, organizing around shared needs and capabilities. People with medical training found themselves suddenly in charge of healthcare. People with agricultural knowledge became essential for food production. People with engineering skills became critical for rebuilding infrastructure. The selection criteria, horrifying as they were, had preserved the human capacity to rebuild. Thea Corvus sat in the ruins of the Geneva office building 5 weeks after the entities appeared, looking at population projections on a laptop running on solar battery power and a jury-rigged connection to one of the few still functional communication satellites. The model showed humanity at 5.7 billion, with slow but stable growth projected over the next 70 years if consumption patterns changed, if resource use became sustainable, if the hard lessons were actually learned. If. A very big if. She knew in her heart that humanity wouldn't learn. Humans were optimized by evolution for short-term thinking, for immediate advantage, for competing with each other, rather than cooperating for long-term sustainability. Give them 70 years and they'd be right back over carrying capacity, consuming beyond regenerative limits, triggering another assessment. The countdown had already begun. Damien Crowe had returned to what remained of Vatican City, or at least the ruins of it. The entity that had hovered over Rome had been particularly thorough. Italy had the world's oldest population before the culling, and the casualties had been correspondingly severe. But the Vatican archives had survived, deep in their climate-controlled vaults, and Damien had spent weeks recovering more manuscripts. He found one that had been overlooked for centuries, misfiled in a collection of mundane administrative documents from the 14th century. It was a prayer, written by a Benedictine monk named Brother Thomas, who had survived the Black Death in 1351, after watching his entire monastery die around him. The Latin was simple, elegant, and devastating. Domine non sumus filii tui, sed pecora tua, et angelis sunt pastores qui gregem custodiunt, ne pasqua destruat, utinam numeros nostros curare discamus, ne pastores cum forficibus acutioribus redeant. Lord, we are not your children, but your cattle, and the angels are shepherds who keep the herd from destroying the pasture. May we learn to tend our own numbers, lest the shepherds return with sharper shears. Brother Thomas had understood. In 1351, in the immediate aftermath of Europe losing half its population, he'd understood exactly what the Black Death had been. A culling. A population reduction to sustainable levels. And he'd understood it would happen again if humans didn't learn to manage themselves. 675 years later, his words proved prophetic. Sister Beatrice had survived as the entity promised, reclassified from non-essential to useful. She was organizing medical care for survivors, in what remained of the Vermont town near the facility where she'd been living. Her training, her multilingual capabilities, her proven psychological resilience, all the factors that had made her worth preserving, were now being put to use saving those who could still be saved. Sometimes at night, lying in whatever building had space for sleeping, she could still feel the presence watching from the upper atmosphere, waiting to see if her utility continued, waiting to determine if she maintained her classification or slipped back into the non-essential category in the next assessment 73 years from now. She wondered if she'd still be alive then. She'd be 120 years old, unlikely, but her children might be, if she had any. Her grandchildren definitely would be. They would face the next counting. Owen Kellen continued monitoring satellite feeds from his warehouse in Reykjavik, one of the least affected cities due to Iceland's small population and relatively sustainable resource use. The country had lost only 8% of its population, far below the global average of 30%, because it had already been living closer to carrying capacity. The geometric patterns remained visible in the upper atmosphere, fainter now but still present, still counting, still watching. He documented everything, maintaining his database, tracking the patterns as they slowly faded into background levels but never disappeared completely. The entities hadn't left. They'd just become less visible, less obvious, but they were still there, still monitoring, still ready to intervene if humanity exceeded parameters again. Tobias Kane's final broadcast before global communication networks collapsed had been viewed by over 3 billion people. The live stream had captured everything. The entities appearing, the deaths beginning, the precise selection criteria becoming evident, the final toll, the entity's message. It was the most watched video in human history, downloaded and saved on millions of devices across the world. He continued broadcasting whenever power and connectivity allowed, documenting the aftermath, recording survivor stories, building a comprehensive historical record of what happened and why. His last major transmission before he lost reliable satellite access was delivered from a rooftop in what remained of Manhattan 6 weeks after the culling. They'll be back. They've always come back. Every few generations, every time we grow too numerous and consume too much, every time we exceed the planet's capacity to sustain us, the angels return. They don't appear to protect humanity. They appear to measure it, and when the measure exceeds acceptable limits, they trim us back to sustainable levels. They always have. They always will. He paused, looking directly into his camera, with eyes that had seen humanity measured and found wanting. We have 73 years. 73 years to prove we can manage ourselves. 73 years to learn to live within our means, to stop growing beyond capacity, to stop destroying the ecological systems that keep us alive. If we fail, if we're back over 6 billion people in 73 years, if we're consuming beyond regenerative limits, if we're in ecological overshoot again, they'll come back. And next time they might not just trim. The entities told Cardinal Rossi in 1666 that this is the 7th planting. 6 civilizations before us exceeded capacity and were completely destroyed, ploughed under, reset to zero. We're being given chances that previous versions of humanity never got, but those chances aren't infinite. Eventually, if we can't learn, they'll give up on us entirely and start fresh with something else. He leaned closer to the camera, voice dropping, but intensity increasing. This is Tobias Kane, reporting from New York City, 6 weeks after the counting. I'm documenting everything, every survivor story, every piece of data, every lesson we should learn from this, because 73 years from now, I'll be dead, but maybe someone watching this will remember. Maybe someone will use this record to convince humanity not to make the same mistakes again. The countdown has already begun. Let's make sure we're ready when it reaches 0. The broadcast ended. In the ruins of cities across the globe, as survivors worked to bury their dead in mass graves and tried to make sense of incomprehensible loss, tried to rebuild some semblance of civilization from the ashes, one truth became undeniable and inescapable. Humanity had been measured against some cosmic standard of sustainability and found to be in excess. The angels had come not to save, but to subtract, not to bless, but to balance, not to protect, but to prune. And they would come again in exactly 73 years to measure once more. The only question was whether humanity would learn to count its own numbers, manage its own growth, live within its means, or whether they would need the angels to do the counting for them again. 73 years, 26,645 days, just over 2 full human generations. The clock was already ticking, and in the upper atmosphere, 40,000 feet above the surface of a planet that had just lost 30% of its human population in 42 hours, the entities continued their eternal watch. Their rings rotated slowly, steadily, processing data about the surviving populations, monitoring birth rates, tracking resource consumption, calculating growth projections, measuring humanity against the standards of sustainability that had governed their intervention for millennia. Counting. Always counting. Waiting patiently to see if the 7th planting would finally learn what the previous 6 had failed to understand. That growth cannot be infinite on a finite planet. That every ecosystem has limits. That exceeding carrying capacity invites correction. The angels were patient. They had time. They'd been doing this work since humans first discovered agriculture and population density became possible. They'd watched civilizations rise and fall 6 times before. They could wait another 73 years. The question wasn't whether they would return. The question was what they would find when they did.